Okay, mic's on, here we go. Hi there and welcome to our live coverage of the US-Israeli war on Iran, which has entered its second week, potentially a new phase as well. We're going to take a broad look today at all the latest, we being Anthony Howard and Shani Rozanes with me here in the studio. After a week, it feels like we are just starting to see some of the consequences of these massive and sustained attacks ripple out from Iran and right across the region as we talk to you live from our studios here in Berlin and across the world. Big hello to you, whether you're watching on YouTube or on our TikTok stream as well. A new supreme leader has been chosen in Iran, but we still don't know who it is. There are rumours. I'm going to talk to you, Shani, about that, but no confirmation of the name as these massive strikes continue across Iran. We'll get to that shortly. There are also visuals of what we need to talk to our first guest after Shani about and the dramatic video that goes with it. That video from Tehran, those incredible nighttime shots. We'll also be talking about the school strike that Iranian officials say killed at least 150 school children. We'll hear from Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. Trump says it was Iran who did that. Pete Hegseth says the US is investigating. I'd love to know how our audience feel about that, who to trust at the moment. That's going to be a theme that develops across this conflict, who to trust and who to listen to. We've talked a lot about how long Iran can keep fighting with this level of intensity, this energy in their counterstrikes. We'll see how that answer comes from the Iran Revolutionary Guard. They say they can keep up this cadence of counterstrikes for 6 months. Is that the truth? We don't know for sure. Time will tell. Let's have a listen.
Our capable armed forces of the powerful Islamic Republic are fully prepared for an all-out, highly intense 6 months war at this same level of intensity. The missiles we've used so far are all from the first and second generation, the ones that were produced in 2012 and later on and have been manufactured over the past 10 years, we haven't used at all.
Right, Shani Rozanes is our Middle East expert in-house here at DW. Joining me in the studio, it's good to see you, Shani. In the midst of war, it does get difficult to decipher the words of any one of the interested parties because it's all about projection of strength and power, particularly when it comes to the use of weapons. We're now hearing that a new supreme leader has been chosen in Iran, but they still have not been publicly named. Do we know who it even could be at this point?
Well, there's several names, but one of the strongest contenders is Mujtaba, the son of the late Khamenei, who was assassinated by Israeli and U.S. forces a week ago. He was, the idea of who was going to be the successor is something that the Iranians, the Ayatollah regime has been dealing with for quite some time because the leader, Khamenei, was getting old and old. It was clear that his days might not, it wasn't unreasonable to think that the question of a successor will become relevant sooner or later. It became more relevant and quite impeding sooner than I think the Iranians have expected. And the son of Khamenei as a possible successor is an interesting choice in the sense that it, of course, sends a message of defiance and continuation. If Trump was hoping for a pragmatic, reform, more open leader, then this is not the choice. I think the signal that is being sent is very clear when it comes to that. But then also at the same time, it's somewhat, part of what the revolution wanted to do when it toppled the Shah back in 1979 was, to fight monarchies, to fight the idea of succession, of the transfer of power that stays within the family. And going to this choice, of course, is somewhat, I can see how even people that are fans of the regime, which are very few left, but still a big enough core supporting and sustaining this regime. I'm sure that's also not an easy choice for many of them. But the name Boris has been there. One of the other names that was very strongly mentioned was actually the grandson of Khomeini, not Khomeini, the first Ruhollah Khomeini, the first one to have rule Iran after the revolution. So again, we're staying with this very close-knit, selection of names. that are connected to the core of the revolution when it comes to the ideology, the religion, the system, that the regime has been prompting and supporting for the last 47 years.
It's fascinating. It does feel like the world, we suddenly have a stake in who the next leader is. How will the decision, the ultimate decision, influence how the world interacts with Iran?
Well, I think there's still so much to see about where Iran lands, and also where this leader, when will he be announced? Partially, I'm sure whoever it is who gets the position, he understands that his days could be numbered as long as this war is ongoing. So this is, of course, something that I understand is partially also connected to why they're being very hesitant with publicly announcing the name.
Isn't it? Whoever takes over is in a very dangerous chair.
Exactly. It's not the best way to ensure a safe exit to pension, I would say, right now. But I do agree with you that whoever's going to be leading Iran is a big question, and it's a big factor to take into consideration trying to figure out the future of this conflict and Iran and the future of this regime. But the very fact that this is, Iran has a very clear constitution that talks about the three. What we're seeing now, the council led by three people, that's supposed to be the whole mechanism of the transfer of power. It's all something that I've been very much ready and waiting for. We need to keep in mind that this regime has spent 50 years fortifying itself. It spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of thought into thinking how to secure this beyond beyond this first generation. What we've seen of Khamenei, these are the first generation of revolutionaries who took over, and how do you build the system to last? And I think we also need to keep in mind. Just for example, let's take an example from Syria and Bashar al-Assad. It took, I think, 13 years from the day that the Syrian civil war started until he was toppled. So it could be that what we're seeing now, and everybody, I think, would like to see coming to a conclusion within days or weeks, could be that this effect, the ripple effect of what we're seeing now, will be something that will take a few years until we make it to the end, to a new regime in Iran.
More to the now. Amid these questions about Iran's new spiritual leadership and the direction of it and all the ramifications that come with that, the IRGC are talking a pretty big game, as we heard on the way in, as to their weapon stocks. We're trying to work out how long this might go, and no one knows for sure. That's, I guess, the truth. What do we know for sure, if anything, about the amount of weapons Iran still has?
Yeah, as you say, we don't know much for sure. This is something but this is definitely what will determine the future of this conflict. How long can it be sustained? And now we're seeing both sides trying to show that we don't care for time. We are here for the long stretch. We will fight as long as we need. The clocks are ticking, though, however, in different speed in each place. For Israelis, I think they're ticking the fastest, because they are the ones, them, and also in the Gulf, they are the ones, definitely Lebanon. These are the places where, this war is felt most intensively. People, civilians, their daily lives, the routine, the economic, the country, they're at standstill. Well, to different degrees in different parts that I've mentioned, but definitely their clock is ticking much faster than the one in America. The U.S. president, of course, needs to fight off the opposition. He needs to fight off the resistance that is within his own MAGA crowd, with his own Republican audience. But at the same time, the effect on the daily lives of most Americans is very minimal. Right. That will change the more we will see oil prices, gas prices, the energy markets going crazy and crazy. This is something we've been seeing. The momentum was quite clear. And we're also seeing that Israelis and Americans are targeting oil facilities in Iran to show, to try to hit Iran's soft belly. But also the signal that it sends is something that we're trying to be very careful with so far, because the idea was to try to maintain and sustain oil prices, energy prices to the most stable level possible. The moment that they're signaling to the markets that this might not be the case, we might see that the volatility goes even wilder, and that could also be shortening the time period of this whole conflict for the Americans.
We're going to talk about that volatility with our next guest we'll speak to in a couple of minutes' time. We've been seeing pictures of the Tehran Skyliners line, the anecdotal evidence of the campaign. Another thing we know for sure is that Iran continues to fight back. The counterstrikes are real and sustained. It's hitting its neighbours. They say it's about hitting anyone who's providing support to this US or Israeli campaign. What do we know for sure? What's the latest we know in terms of these counterstrikes?
Well, if you listen to some Israeli experts in people connected to the Israeli defense system, they're trying to find hope or being optimistic by claiming that what we're actually seeing in Iran is actually two voices that are speaking. We have heard the president saying yesterday, Pezeshkian, saying Iran will not attack any of its neighbors anymore. But then soon after, we did see more attacks on the Gulf countries. We're also hearing this morning about the possibility of the UAE, that was actually one of the main targets of Iran. It had been hit by more frequently than Israel itself. I mean, the UAE is retaliating against the Iranians. This is something we will need to watch and see how this develops. So definitely the Iranians are, it could be that we're seeing indications that it connects, of course, to the most expected chaos in leadership after these days. But it could also be that, on the level of the ground, the operational on the ground, the level of people who are, committed to keep on the fight for Iran, they had a very clear plan on what's happening, how it should happen. And they seem to be not too deterred or not too impressed by any political force trying to sway them in a different direction.
On that motivation and the dedication, if you like, to these counter-strikes, these latest strikes have included Kuwait and Bahrain. The pictures are dramatic. The attacks remain consistent as we enter the second week of the conflict. We've heard from the Secretary of Iran's National Security Council, Ali Larijani. Here he is.
The strikes carried out by the Islamic Republic will continue. They should not think that we will allow the Americans to quickly bring this matter to an end and then say, we struck them, now let's wrap it up. This can only be wrapped up when they understand that they no longer have the right to attack Iran and when they compensate the Iranian nation for damages. This disgraceful act they have committed on the international stage carries a heavy cost. They assassinated the leader of Iran. The price for it will not be small.
Shani, you first.
Yeah, so we saw Ali Larijani. He was one of the closest aides to Khamenei, and he's probably considered to be one of the most influential, if not the most influential figure in Iran, calling the shots and setting the tone for what's happening. And we're hearing very, very defiant, the need also to avenge the honor of the late Khamenei, of course, is something also they take personally. They definitely the people who were so close to him in his most immediate circle. If we're trying to talk about Iran and its ability to actually sustain this long term, we know that the Iranians have been waiting for this, have been getting ready for it far more intensely since June of 2025, when there was the previous round of attack. Back then, again, also initiated by Israel. Most of what they have done is that they're trying to hide and dig very deep down their launchers and their missile stockpiles. And this is exactly what we're seeing now. The Americans and the Israelis going at, we've seen the B-52 bombers the Americans have been sending starting yesterday, trying to penetrate deeper into the underground levels where these stockpiles are, where the Iranians are trying to, hide most of their military arsenal. And the level of success that the Israel and the Americans will get in the next days, which is a phase, this is what they're aiming for in the next days, that will determine how long can Iran really sustain itself in this fight, in this counterfight. And it's also important very much to listen to the Iranians in the sense that even if we're talking about Trump considering, at the first days we were discussing, will there be negotiations again, will there be some sort of an agreement? I mean, it could also be, if you hear Trump very much, sound very, very confident and very proud of the success that the Americans have had so far. Even, sort of in a way, almost trying to constantly have the alibi or the ability to pull the brake, the emergency brake, and say we've done our share, we want out. Yeah. No one guarantees that the Iranians will follow suit. It could be that the Americans say, OK, we're done. We have achieved our goals. No one guarantees that the Iranians will say, OK, we're holding fire too. On the contrary, they might actually be using that. So any solution out, any way out, that's still too far to sketch. There's too much up in the air, unfortunately. Yeah,
we're trying to get a map of the way forward. And I guess part of the way to do that is understand the people of Israel and what they want and what the government might be forced into thinking or that want to project on their behalf. I want to know about the connection between the government's actions and the military, and what do Israelis think might count as victory? When do they think they might have reached that goal of to what the goal was here in this war, and when they might get there? What counts as victory for Israel?
Well, Israel wants to first tackle Iran's nuclear facilities to the max. We still know, for example, there's more than 400 kilos of enriched uranium that has reached to a level of higher than 60%. That's very close to the nuclear threshold you would need. These 400 plus kilos, they're already missing since June, and they're believed to be somewhere very deeply buried around the Isfahan nuclear facility, for example. That is basically Iran's insurance policy. You know, they could always go back to that, but it's also something you'd be very careful with. Nobody wants to, you know, to bomb 400 kilos of enriched uranium. This is also something that, you know, you need to tread very carefully around. But Israel wants to see a removal, as Netanyahu is saying, a removal of the Iranian threat. What would it look like on the ground? I think everybody is keeping quite vague on purpose. Though we have seen the Israelis far more dedicated and far more publicly, seeing themselves obligated to the cause of a regime change in Iran. Something we've seen the Americans a bit more, careful with clearly announcing. So, and again, if we're talking a little bit about the time ticking, the clock ticking in different pace, above Israel and Iran. Again, Israel is being personally far more affected by Americans, even though we have also seen, and Trump yesterday was talking, as he was, as the bodies of U.S. soldiers were coming back to burial in the U.S. So, of course, there is also a direct U.S. stake on this, and there are also U.S. lives that are being on the line here as well. Again, I think when it comes to what Israelis want, Netanyahu himself has managed to, has been talking about the Iranian nuclear program, the Iranian missiles, for so long. Many in Israel are falling now behind, the rally to the flag. That's also a common thing we've also seen in Iran. That's a common response for every nation as it's in war. But we will see, the longer this gets and the more disrupted Israeli civil life are, we will see more and more people starting to doubt what's the end strategy, what's the end goal, and how achievable it is. We're still not there yet.
Totally. Do the Israeli people accept that missile attacks are a direct consequence of attacking Iran? Do they accept those consequences? And on balance, do they think what is being achieved in Iran is worth that risk?
Yes and yes. It's understandable. They know very much Israel is the aggressor. Israel is also taking pride. If we hear Netanyahu speaking yesterday, he's talking about only those who dare win. And what I have decided, he also brings it all together, he connects it to October 7th. He said, I have decided following October 7th, Israel needs to change strategy. We want to have a whole new perception of security and defense where we are the ones taking the initiatives. We are the one who are daring. We are the one who are showing a very strong, aggressive approach to any threat because we were willing to contain them for too long. And this is what we got in the end, talking about October 7th. We're talking the Hamas terror attack on Israeli southern border, and the 1,200 Israelis who were murdered that day. So for Netanyahu, and he keeps bringing that back. We also hear Trump talking about that. This is all connected. This is one fight. This is one war. Who was initiated by Hamas back then on October 7th? Who is a militia. Of course, first of all, it's a terror organization, but it's also aligned and sponsored and prompted up by the Iranians. For many years, we know that there was, of course, financial support of the Iranians to Hamas, but also when it comes to training and real help and skills that Iranians were giving to Hamas and Hamas operatives throughout the years. So Netanyahu is trying to frame it all together in a sense of this is a fight against this axis of evilness, of brutality, of extremist jihadist forces. This is how he names it. This is how he refers to that. And in that aspect, it's very easy for him to bring the Israeli people to support him and to support this goal and to understand that they would need to endure a little longer. How much longer? This is the question.
Right. Shani, let's get ready to pivot back to one particular strike here. The most striking, the most obvious being a hit on an oil storage facility on the outskirts of Tehran. We're going to look at those pictures again, resulting in a massive tower of black smoke. What do we know about that strike? And the fact it's very obviously an energy target. Thank you. And on that note, it's time to bring in another voice to this conversation, because we want to talk about how much of a problem this could become for the world economy, and not just the region. That's what we want to ask Yesar Maleki, who's a Gulf analyst at the Middle East Economic Survey. He's an energy economist with an eye on geopolitics. Thanks for being with us here today, Yesar. We want to know Qatar's energy. Good to see you. We want to know, Qatar's energy minister has predicted that this war could force the Gulf's energy producers to shut down. Let's start by asking you, how likely do you think that is?
It's already happening. Global oil markets, have very little spare capacity to absorb a prolonged disruption in the Gulf. And what we have been seeing since last week, which started really with Iraq was the first domino to fall in the region, started, to hit the limits of what they can store. And over the weekend now, we have seen Kuwait also declaring force majeure, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. So because, major producers in the regions are unable to export their oil, so they are quickly hitting those limits, as I said, of what they can store either onshore or overseas on, tankers at sea that are stranded inside the Gulf. So as the storage fills up, producers are increasingly forced to slow or shut down their production. And the pace of these closures have accelerated over the weekend. So this conflict in the Middle East has triggered a wave of disruption in global energy markets that is unprecedented. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively at a standstill. It's a choke point for 20% of global oil flows, nearly a fifth of LNG exports. Most of these are coming from Qatar Energy. CEO, you mentioned the CEO, Saad Al-Ka'bi. So the interruption is really significant. And as I said, there is no spare capacity to make up for that. And the market will only calm if once we see, some safe transit through the Hormuz Strait resuming. But the strikes over the past 24 hours, you mentioned the one on the fuel depot in Tehran, but also we have seen attacks on oil fields in Saudi Arabia over the past 24 hours, desalination plants in Iran, desalination plant in Bahrain, and we have seen earlier attacks also last week on Ras Al Noura refinery in Saudi Arabia. Over the weekend, yesterday on oil facilities in Basra in Iraq. So, increasingly the energy infrastructure is becoming a direct target in this conflict, and this is not boding well for the market.
Yeah, so no chance we're blowing this out of proportion by the sounds of it. What specifically are the knock-on effects to all of that activity and all of that destruction as you're talking about?
So, the knockout effect is quite global. So we are seeing a few trends. So Asian consumers are scrambling for alternative oil supplies. At the heart of this adjustment is China and India, and Europe is also facing a refined fuel supply challenge. So Asia, by far, is the most exposed region to the disruption in Gulf exports. Almost 90% of crude oil and gas condensates that were leaving the Gulf, that typically leave the Strait of Hormuz. They head to Asia, and refiners in China and India are particularly dependent on Middle Eastern barrels. So as the flows from the Gulf have stalled, the governments in Asia and in other regions are preparing emergency responses. They are planning to, some of them are considering to release strategic crude reserves in countries like Japan and South Korea. They are also restricting product exports to safeguard domestic fuel oil supply. And in terms of the shift, Asian importers are quickly pivoting towards alternative supplies. So that is from the United States, from the Atlantic Basin, West Africa, and this sudden shift in buying is changing the patterns. It has pushed premiums for Atlantic Basin oil, crude significantly, higher than before. The crisis is also tightening the global shipping tankers capacity. 6% is already stuck inside the Gulf. We have around 250 tankers that cannot leave the Gulf with oil. Some of them have oil on them, and these are quite flammable targets. This is happening in an already constrained market. So as ships are now repositioning from the Atlantic Basin to Asia, they are going to take longer and less typical routes for extended periods of time. This reduces the available capacity overall, drives up the freight rates. And what we are seeing is a rapid reconfiguration of global oil flows, potentially the largest since the adjustments, stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay. So the effects are real and dramatic. It does sound like a pretty bleak picture, but I'm really pleased that you're painting it for us. Motorists are facing long queues at gas stations as well. Some countries are rationing supplies, we believe. Diesel prices have seen the steepest rise. Experts say prices could see even bigger increases than those experienced 4 years ago at the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As you reference, Yesar, the spikes have left many motorists asking how they'll find the money to keep putting their fuel in the cars. And no doubt when energy prices go up, that affects pretty much everyone all over the world, as you say. Let's take a listen before I come back to you, how some people have been reacting to the first tangible signs that the conflict in Iran will have consequences.
If petrol is running out, we demand the government reduce prices. The way they're being increased is unfair. This evening it was 264 rupees. Then suddenly it went up to 323. What is a poor person whose income is only 700 rupees supposed to do? How are we supposed to choose between buying petrol and feeding our children?
The fuel I've received is barely sufficient, but I spent a very long time queuing for it. Once it's run out, I'll have to come back and stand in a queue for hours again.
It's always worrying. It's another hit to our wallets. We already know this happens in wars. Prices will also rise in supermarkets and transportation. I came because of the price increase, even though I don't need to yet. I thought it was better to fill up.
The state must release fuel from the reserve, for example, for a week at lower prices, until we know where this crisis is heading.
Right, we also want to hear from our audience, both on TikTok and YouTube. Yesar, I'll send a message to them that they can leave their comments or their questions for you or for us, any which way you want to do this. How high are the energy prices where you are, for instance? Let us know. Yesar, it does feel like the global economic impact that you paint the picture of will govern at least part of the equation as to how events unfold in Iran, as politicians do talk tough until the economy goes bad and then they feel the pressure. How much longer do we have to wait before this goes really bad?
So what we have right now is a disruption. If it becomes, it depends on how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz evolves. So if it prolongs, this might become an energy shock. And, energy shocks from geopolitical conflict don't just affect oil markets. They reshape inflation, interest rate policy, growth, and the growth prospects worldwide. The biggest economic risk from this conflict is surging. It is surging just as global inflation was finally coming down. The shocks, typically ripple through the entire economy and raise in transport costs, as people were talking, in the video that you have shown, food prices and manufacturing expenses. And, this creates a major challenge for central banks. Many were preparing to start actually cutting interest rates. But, that spike in energy prices could delay those decisions and keep rates higher for longer. In the United States, the most immediate channel usually is gasoline prices. So domestic supply in the US, the US is the largest oil producer in the world, that provides a partial buffer, but higher global crude prices still push up gasoline prices. The market is interconnected. It is global by the end of the day, and rising fuel costs feed directly into headline inflation, household spending. It complicates the Federal Reserve's path towards easing monetary policy. Higher prices at the pump also add domestic pressure on the Trump administration. And the Republican Party, affordability is a big issue and a key issue in the US midterm elections. Europe may even have, is more vulnerable today. The economy has been growing slowly and remains sensitive to energy costs. In Asia, the issue is largely the import bill. Major economies like China, India, Japan, and South Korea depend heavily on imported energy. So if the conflict persists, the global economy could could face stagflationary dynamic, where inflation rises again while economic growth slows. So that's the issue at stake here.
Yeah, so you mind quickly taking a question from an audience member for us? We've got one from YouTube specifically for you, a user called Sikmachan on YouTube. Are there more oil reserves in this world aside from Venezuela and the Middle East, is the question.
Well, yeah, America is a big producer, but it is also, the shale revolution in the US was a big factor in pushing the United States to become a big oil producer. We have new markets also coming in Guyana, in Brazil. North Sea is a major production base, but of course, you have to consider a few things. It's not just about reserves, it's about the cost of a production. The Middle East provides a very unique, set of reserves. It's a large resource base with low extraction costs. This is why we have seen this accumulation of production capacity in this region of the world, and why we have this issue today when we have a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, or even Bab el-Mandeb, Strait of Bab el-Mandeb on the other side in the Red Sea, where the Houthis are typically active, poses problems for energy security in the world.
Yeah, so a question from Shani, Rozanes sitting next to me here.
Yes, I'm wondering, Yesar, if miraculously this war ends tomorrow, how big is the shock? How easy would it be for the markets and for the prices to go back and to recover back? How much of what we're seeing here is irreparable?
That is a good question, and I want to answer this in two ways. So first of all, it will take some time, a few weeks, even months, to restart production. Restarting production is not an easy thing to do. So Qatar Energy, for instance, they shut off their Ras Laffan complex, which is the world's largest complex, 77 million tons per year of LNG, one fifth of the world supply. That will take some time to restart. You have a lot of systems. And this could take all the way to mid-March if we start doing it from next week. The same is with oil fields and oil wells. There are pressure to consider, reservoir damage, very technical issues, but it will pick up with time. In terms of oil prices, I have to explain a couple of things here. What we have seen in the past week is that oil prices have slowly risen. The oil prices climbed to their highest level in 2 years at above $90 per barrel by the end of last week, because we saw all the disruptions and we saw the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But interestingly, the initial market reaction was relatively restrained. Prices were below $85 per barrel for most of the week, and that was that raised a lot of question marks given the scale of the geopolitical shock. By the end of the day, closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the worst case scenario that organizations like the IEA and producers in the region have been preparing for decades. So the cautious response reflected several factors that were already priced into the market. So first of all, there was a geopolitical risk premium that was, within the oil price as the U.S. military build-up, and resources came into the region. There is seasonal oil demand is weaker in the first quarter of the year. Consuming countries have also built buffers in China and the OECD, and there has been a market sentiment dominating, which is this persistent narrative of global oversupply. Now, these concerns have shifted, I think by the end of last week to supply availability. And, this crisis, I think, will answer a very important to question whether, we truly are facing a supply glut in this market or not.
Oil prices have surged, Yesar, as the war in Iran causes major disruption to energy production in the Middle East, as you've painted that picture pretty clearly. I want to take a look at a graph showing how Brent crude oil prices have jumped above $90 a barrel, and they're expected to rise even more as the war goes on. But even someone with a schoolboy understanding of the markets knows that volatility can be a profitable thing depending where in the world you are. We're looking at that graph right now. Apologies. How could other energy producers, as we look at that graph and in a pretty clear trend, how could other energy producers benefit from this? I'm thinking, for example, of the US and Russia. Are the higher energy prices good news for them, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, you see, in the US, shale oil producers are, price is a big factor in how much they can pump, how much production they can put. So they have something called break-even prices, and some fields require high break-even prices to produce. So this is good news in a way, but at the same time, you have to look at the capacity of how much they can, export. So, in terms of the supply to the global market, so in terms of LNG, for instance, or gas, U.S. terminals are producing almost at capacity. So this is a problem for consumers in Asia and in Europe. Now, Russia is a different issue. The Russians have been under heavy sanctions from the U.S. and its European allies. Price caps. They have sanctioned barrels that they have been sending to mainly India and China and Turkey and other places. And the initial indications are that Russia is actually benefiting on the short term from a price spike. That is happening because the premiums on their sanctioned barrels are increasing. So they are making some money out of this.
Yes, so stand by. We are going to move to another guest shortly, but I want to address one more thing. I want to bring in a clip from an interview with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was speaking to Fox Business Network's Larry Kudlow.
Yesterday, Treasury agreed to let our allies in India start buying Russian oil that was already on the water. The Indians had been very good actors. We had asked them to stop buying sanctioned Russian oil this fall. They did. They were going to substitute it with U.S. oil. But to ease the temporary gap of oil around the world, we have given them permission to accept the Russian oil. We may unsanction other Russian oil.
Yeah, now, not surprisingly, the Indian government, Yesar, has put out a statement in response. You can see it on the screen hopefully soon. I'll read it out. India has never depended on permission from any country to buy Russian oil. It added, India is still importing Russian oil, even in February of 2026, and Russia is still India's largest crude oil supplier. So I guess I want to know from you before we leave, what's going on? The US says it is relaxing sanctions on Russian oil being sent to India. India says it never stopped applying those sanctions in the first place. It's a strange market as we see it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a special case. And this is the first thing to stress about this waiver. The other thing is that, I don't think this waiver is unlikely to be extended more broadly. It does not meaningfully improve the global oil supply. What it does, it allows India to access Russian oil that is already stranded, nearby in the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Singapore for 30 days. So it is not. It is just a redistribution of existing barrels. It does not add a new supply to the market. But the idea here is that by diverting these Russian barrels to India, the maybe frees up non-Russian oil supplies to other Asian buyers, and eases the impact on the impact of this crunch on the global market, and and it allows them not to those Asian buyers and other buyers not to compete over whatever other supplies are available. But the broader market impacts remain limited from this. It's not transformational. I think India is very is especially vulnerable. More than 50% of its imports come from the Middle East. But this also marks a reversal in policy by Washington. Uh, India was under a lot of pressure from the US, and that pressure was working. If you remember, they were adding punitive tariffs on India to force it to reduce its imports of Russian oil, and that was actually working. Russia was going back to its traditional suppliers from the Gulf. But again, this is a practical move, from the U.S. administration, trying to simply help the redistribution of whatever supply is available in the market. And by the end of the day, the benefit for India is mainly domestic. Less pressure on inflation, the current account deficit, and of course the currency, the rupee.
Okay, quickly before we go, two more questions, one from the audience, one from me. Where does Iran usually send its oil, and is it enough to put a dent in someone's supply? And the audience question, is this all accelerating our transition toward electric vehicles and solar power?
Right. So on the first one, mainly to China, almost 90%, more than 90% to China. And, interestingly, Iran has around 140 million barrels of floating storage and oil in transit. And usually the buyers in China are those small independent refineries in Shandong province. They are called teapots. And they take all of that, volume usually at very discounted prices. Although, in recent days, looking at the flows, there hasn't been much buying from these buyers. So it is very sensitive for them because they could be subjected to secondary U.S. sanctions, and especially at this point when there is a war between the U.S. and Russia. So that's to answer that question. And just a bit on that question, China has 1.1 to 1.3 billion of stocks. So it has many alternative suppliers as well. We are already seeing Chinese buyers, buy Atlantic Basin oil and are ready to pay for the premium. So China is very well supplied compared to other places. To answer the question on EVs and the transition to green energy, yes, of course, there are many lessons to be learned from this crisis. I think, especially when it comes to the gas aspect of this, because gas is very important in the electricity generation. I think the Europeans are going to double down on the energy transition, but by the end of the day, the energy transition has its limitations. Green energy, and there had been also some realism in the market in terms of fossil fuels, and especially gas in Europe, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Europe will need to balance these considerations in coming years. But just one last bit on lessons. I think some of the lessons are already being deployed in this conflict. So Hormuz bypass pipelines that some Gulf producers built in preparations for this scenario are working, but they are of course not enough to replace all the supply that is being lost. Inventories are already available, for the IEA to use and for many consumers, and this is a tested, supply option that is available, and the market has shown that it can quickly react to these disruptions, as shown in what happened after the war with Ukraine. But I think the lesson to learn is that we need to increase tanker availability in the market, and the market is distorted with the dark fleet and the legal fleet. But that is something to discuss later, I guess. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yes, sir. Yesar Maleki, Gulf analyst at the Middle East Economic Survey. Thanks for sharing your insights with us. You were very patient and very generous. From everyone here in Berlin, a big thanks. And to everyone in the chat on TikTok and YouTube as well, by the look of it. Many thanks. All right, let's now turn to a strike on an elementary school in southern Iran that killed scores of children. This was early on in the war and has been the deadliest incident of civilian casualties so far. Now, evidence suggests that the United States military was responsible for the strike. Human Rights Watch has carried out analysis, so have several US outlets, including the New York Times and CNN. The elementary school in Minab was hit on February 28 at around the same time as an attack that American forces likely carried out on a neighbouring IRGC naval base. Now, Niku Jafarnia is a researcher with the Middle East and North Africa Division on Human Rights Watch. She joins us now from Beirut to talk more about this. Niku, it seems like the details of the attack were hard to get, hard to verify as we say hello, as well as hard to imagine anything much worse than that. From what I've said, is there anything more that you have heard in your research on the matter, for sure, that you want to add to this pretty grim picture?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'm glad that we're able to talk about the strike, even though it's quite a devastating attack to even be discussing. And the number of the children killed in this strike is regardless of how many we've been able to verify, is just a devastating number to be discussing to begin with. What we can say at this point is in some ways quite similar to what the New York Times, CNN, and others have found, with just a bit of added detail in some cases regarding what we've been able to see from satellite imagery. As you mentioned yourself, it's quite challenging at this moment in time to get information on the attack due to, at least in part, due to Iranian authorities' own shutdown of the internet and threats against people from being able to speak to begin with about what has occurred across not just this attack, but in general. This has been the case with Iranian authorities for decades at this point. So we really have had to rely on, very heavily, as did others, on the use of satellite imagery analysis, as well as desk research to really try to understand what has happened here. What we do know is that the school, I think people have disputed whether it was part of the IRGC naval compound, which is what you're seeing in this map right now, whether it was part of that compound or whether it was separate from the compound. But what we have clearly been able to identify, along with everyone else at this point, is really that the school is a distinct structure. It was walled off for at least the last 10 years. And at the end of the day, there were children present, and children were in school on the day of this attack. And both the US and Israel have two of the most advanced militaries in the world, and absolutely should have known that there was a school here and that children were present, and should not have attacked the school as one of them has done. And we're not definitively stating whether it was the US or Israel.
Niku, do you expect or do you hope that the US will thoroughly investigate this?
I mean, of course, I hope that they will thoroughly investigate. Whether I expect them to do so is another question. We do call on the US to investigate and assess its responsibility for the strike and make its findings public. We don't do the same for Israel, considering we have over many years documented the fact that the Israeli military's investigations mechanisms are fundamentally flawed, often failing to hold perpetrators to account for serious violations of the law. With the US, while we have often found that the US military has not adequately investigated its own crimes, and in many cases has very much fallen short of providing real accountability for some of the violations of the law that they've carried out, we do still call on them to investigate their own crimes. I think what we're concerned about, though, in this case, is that under the second Trump administration, the Defense Department has deliberately and systematically weakened its domestic protections meant to ensure its compliance with the laws of armed conflict. That includes the termination of senior military lawyers, reported loosening of targeting protocols, and an elimination of the civilian environment teams within the operational chain of command. So I think there has been a lot of changes made to the U.S. Department of Defense, or I suppose it now called the U.S. Department of War, that makes it really unclear whether we can continue to be able to call on them to carry out thorough and adequate investigations in cases like this.
All right, Niku, stay with me. I just want to have a listen to the US President. Here he is talking about the matter to reporters.
The United States bomb a girls' elementary school in southern Iran on the first day of the war and kill hundreds of
No, in my opinion, based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Nixon? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating. But the only side that targets civilians is Iran. We think it was done by Iran. Because they're very inaccurate, as you know, with their munitions. They have no accuracy whatsoever. It was done by Iran.
OK, there you go, listening to Peter Hegseth and Donald Trump. I guess working in Human Rights Watch, you need to believe there will be accountability. Do you believe there will be?
You know, I really hope so. I think we're living through a really challenging time for the case of international law and accountability. There's no denying that. After, these last 2 years of watching both Israel and now the US in many of their actions, really unravel a lot of, and other countries as well who are complicit in that, unravel a lot of the threads of international law and accountability globally in their actions abroad and particularly in the region. However, I think there is just no way forward without just even further chaos, destruction, death in the region without a real look and placing of importance on accountability. We have seen over decades and decades of research at Human Rights Watch across, dozens of countries across the globe, that without accountability, you ultimately are not able to move forward and not able to actually account for what has, if you're not able to account for what has happened, you can't actually live in relative peace, essentially. We have found that there is a relationship there between holding perpetrators to account and actually being able to live in some degree of stability and move on from some of these conflict contexts. And so when we're watching day by day, both the US and Israel and now Iran carry out attack after attack that is, seemingly targeting civilian infrastructure, targeting major civilian infrastructure, targeting areas where it's known that civilians are living and where, in the case of Palestine, thousands upon thousands of civilians have been killed, and it has been well documented. I don't understand, and how we would actually be able to move forward in a context like that, and live with some degree of peace in this region if accountability is not pursued.
Niku, we've heard from the American side. Let's have a listen, if we could, to the spokesperson for the Iranian foreign minister now talking about this.
The people of America should ask their statesmen, were our school children in Minab a threat to America's national security? What threat did the athletes of Lamerd in Fars province pose to America's national security? Let us move beyond that. What threat did Iran's nuclear program pose to America? The nuclear program that in June you said with certainty was obliterated and gone.
OK, just in terms of who to trust at the moment, Iran, US or Israel, do you sympathise with the public who might be finding it hard to make a choice from that trio?
I absolutely sympathize with the public in this case. I mean, all three states are, particularly Israel and Iran, we have well documented their use of propaganda. And in this case, we cannot trust what Iranian authorities are saying. We cannot trust what Israeli authorities are saying. And unfortunately, we also cannot necessarily trust what the US is saying. In this case, Iranian authorities have also carried out an internet blackout, which is, not even allowing people to independently assess what has happened in this case or in any other strikes. And we have documented year after year impunity and cover-ups by the Iranian authorities that make it absolutely impossible to be able to trust anything that they would say in this context. What we need to be doing, and what we as researchers at Human Rights Watch and at many other organizations are doing, is really fully relying on our own independent investigations and not on the information that is being provided by any of these three states. And what we would like to see in a case like this is that there is an independent investigation, not just even though we are calling on the US to also investigate, what really does need to happen here is that there is also an independent investigation done into this strike and into the other strikes that are being carried out both in Iran and by Iran in other states in the region as well.
Niku Jafarnia, a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Brilliant to get your input from Beirut. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right. Thanks so much for everyone taking part today. Thank you, Shani, and thanks to our TikTok and YouTube audience as well. We're getting the hang of hanging out with each other here and asking these questions. Then there is nothing else to do than say a big thanks to our team here in Berlin behind the scenes to remind people where you can see more updates, TikTok and YouTube naturally. But don't sleep on our coverage on Instagram either. It's a really popular spot. Go there and you'll find out why. From me and Shani here in Berlin, it's goodbye for now, and we'll sit here awkwardly until the stream ends. Goodbye.